So we did it to point out that this is globalism. And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms. Doesn't matter how many lemmings you get out there on the street begging for them to have their guns taken. We will not relinquish them. Do you understand?
My name is Ben Burgis, and this is Give Them an Argument. In just a moment, I am going to be joined by Rob Larson, Alex Gourevitch, and Matt Karp for a discussion about freedom, how to conceptualize it, how it relates to capitalism and socialism, and all of that good stuff. This is an episode I've been wanting to do for a while. The clip that you just heard was, of course, professional nutjob Alex Jones arguing with Piers Morgan on CNN several years ago. And I played it because I think that sometimes when some people on the left hear this word freedom, and a lot of emphasis being put on freedom as opposed to other important values like equality or compassion, what we associate with that is basically Alex Jones ranting about how 1776 will begin again. And I think that that's an important mistake. I think it matters that we really reclaim that concept, that we center it in everything that we do. And that is going to be what I'm going to be talking to Rob and Alex and Matt about. After that, for the Outlaws and Revolutionaries segment, back today after a 1-week break, I am going to be talking to David Griscom, who, by the way, just started a new show with Matt Leck that everybody should check out called Left Reckoning. And we are going to be talking about Sturgill Simpson, and his Cuttin Grass album, which is fantastic. Drank some Ardbeg and listened to that last night. But in any case, right now I am joined by Rob Larson, who is the in-house economist at Current Affairs magazine, and among several others, the author of among several other books that he wrote, is the author of a book most relevantly for this discussion, Capitalism and Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom, which is, of course, a play on two classic libertarian books, which would be Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman and The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. So welcome, Rob. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. Always good to be on Give Them an Argument, or if it's Alex Jones's show, Give Them a Hysterical Screaming Match. They're both good.
Yeah, of course, since that clip was since that discussion originally happened on CNN, Alex Jones got divorced and in court with for the custody battle, argued that his lawyers argued that this was just a persona. So the sort of angry, hysterical figure that he cuts normally shouldn't be taken seriously against him for when it comes to deciding the custody of kids. I've always wondered how his fans, of which there are still many, reconcile that, but who knows.
Who indeed? It'll be it'll only be the 6,000 craziest thing that they believed. Craziest thing. So it won't be that bad.
Well, that is certainly fair. They I guess once you've accepted the lizard people and the all that stuff, really what is, he was, I don't know, the court records were falsified or the globalists made him say that or whatever.
Yes. That's right. It's his lawyer and his awful wife. That's so easily rationalized by right people. I don't think that's going to be tough for them.
Fair enough. So in terms of non-insane conceptions of freedom, right? This is what I wanted to have you on to talk about, because a lot of, so for example, last week, I debated this guy, Walter Block, who is, like you, an economist, and somebody who comments on politics. I think those are the only things you have in common. But, but in there, he gave a fairly standard sort of deontic libertarian pitch, which goes something like this. You can't, when you do things like, redistributive taxation, certainly much less like the sorts of things that people like us would want, nationalizing industries, converting things into worker-owned firms, stuff like that, you are violating the freedom of the business owners, which is a framing that I think has been remarkably successful, not just in that sort of extremist fringe libertarian form, but more widely, right? Like even if you think about like the rhetoric of the GOP, it's all about freedom, not just in terms of guns, but in terms of economics, and a lot of people who are somewhere in between being like liberal left or being social democrats, or even who really think of themselves as socialists, essentially accept that freedom, right? They accept that premise. They say, well, I disagree with their conclusions because I think that freedom is less important than some competing value, like, compassion, equality, whatever, pick the competing value. But while that is, whereas I do think that you do often have to weigh competing values, that's a real thing, when they come into conflict, which they can. I think it's also a response that like really severely undersells the kind of case that we make, right? So why do you call this book Capitalism and Unfreedom?
Yeah, right on, man. Well, you're absolutely right. Like that is the big dominant framing around freedom for sure. And you're right. It's not just a right-wing thing. I remember, right when my book was coming out, Carl Beijer, or is it Carl Bayer, the great socialist writer whose work we all enjoy, he had a very thoughtful article he posted saying that the left, broadly speaking, shouldn't be trying to make freedom one of our issues. Like the right owns that too much. And so we should give up on that and focus, on equality or other issues that we leftists tend to focus on, like sustainability and inclusion and stuff like that. And again, as you said, like these are all legitimate things we should be pushing for. Rights aren't axioms. Like they overlap and they contradict each other and shit. That's fine. But I would disagree with Carl. I think there is a lot for us on the left. There's a lot to be gained by thinking about freedom and using it as something that we're fighting for by changing capitalism and the rest of the society, but also something we don't. It's too good of ground to just cede to the right. Like they will beat us with that till the end of time. I mean, they probably will anyway. But we should be contesting that ground too, I think. Yeah. So I wrote Capitalism versus Freedom to kind of go after that ground a little bit. And at least get folks thinking about ways where you can argue with your libertarian friends. And there's, we all have plenty of those, sadly, up to and including Dr. Brock. So in the book, basically, I just take the most conventional framing philosophically, as I understand it, for freedom and liberty, takes that sort of traditional differentiation between negative and positive forms of freedom. Negative, where you're sort of free from outside power centers dictating to you. So with capitalism, you're free to shop for whatever kind of pants you wish to buy, and you can choose what kind of career you want to foolishly go into. And since we're free from anyone dictating those choices to us in the market, we're supposed to be, have our liberty protected by that. But other figures like Isaiah Berlin and even John Mill talked about positive freedom, or sometimes positive rights, where it's about what you're free to do with your liberty. And the idea there is, how free are you to actually achieve different things? Like you might be free to, you might have the right to have healthcare, but if you're poor or you work part-time, in capitalism, you don't have any positive right to healthcare. Something like Medicare for all would be trying to acknowledge that people have positive freedom to things that society is capable of producing. Like once we reach that big growing capitalist material level where we can do something realistically, like provide healthcare for everybody, we socialists would say there's a positive freedom or entitlement or right to that. But this is, as you said, this is good ground. We shouldn't just give this up to crazy pieces of shit like Alex Jones or more moderate, sensible sounding conservatives that we deal with every day.
Yeah, certainly. Look, if nothing else, the most successful left-wing movement of certainly at least since the rise of the big industrial unions, in the 1930s, it was the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. which, despite the fact that one of its central goals was restricting what business owners could do, right? Taking those whites only signs out of the windows, was very successful in claiming that rhetorical ground, right? It's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and that's worth thinking about. And I think that I like the way that you framed that about positive freedom, right? I think, for example, I don't know. I know this is kind of a deep cut. It's from a few years ago. I don't know how many people remember it, but in like 2017, maybe, there was a debate, like a sort of pseudo-presidential kind of debate between Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz about healthcare, where Cruz was using this wording about being free to buy healthcare. And Sanders says, yeah, I mean, I'm also free to, to buy one of Donald Trump's houses, but, I don't know what good that does anybody. And it's also worth thinking about how that relates to substantive life options. And this is definitely where I want to, what people can do with their lives, what projects they can pursue. And this is definitely where I want to bring things back at the end of the discussion. But first, to ground some of this stuff in historical uses of this kind of rhetorical strategy, in their respective areas. I want to bring in the other two panelists, who are two of my favorite left-wing historians, which are Jacobin contributing editor Matt Karp, and Alex Gourevitch, who I talked to over the summer on the Jacobin YouTube channel about the Knights of Labor, and a lot of that discussion, I think, relates to this in a pretty direct way. This is kind of how, even back then, I had the idea for this discussion. So yeah, welcome, guys. Matt, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. I just enjoyed the discussion about. I completely agree with Rob about the. I'm guessing Alex does too, but I'll let him weigh in on the need not to cede the ground of freedom to the right. I mean, that's basically been Eric Foner's life mission over the last 50 years, and I guess by that. If you define it that way, Eric Foner has failed in his life mission. But I mean, he's been writing books about, the Civil War era and Reconstruction, kind of, every single one of them with the title Freedom, and often accompanied by an op-ed that says, freedom is something that egalitarians should care about. And here's the historical, here's a key historical moment where freedom was something that the left fought for and won in significant respect. Clearly that argument has not even been won within the left yet. But it's a good segue to the historical stuff there, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that it's something that maybe it's important that it be won in the left now, in particular, because we're starting to actually have a left again, in a way that outside of academia, outside of marginal protest movements, we kind of didn't. For a long time, so I think that with any luck, Eric Foner's life mission will be a long, indirect long-term success, because his arguments can arm us to win it now. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, it was that discussion with you. At Jacobin that kind of gave me the idea for this, and I remember in particular to start this a little bit out of order, and then I want to go back to the pre-Civil War stuff. But then in that discussion about the Knights of Labor, which is this radical socialist early industrial labor union in the late 19th century. There was a quote that you have. I do not remember who it was from, but he was quoted in one of your articles about the subject from, I think, maybe a Knights of Labor publication, where somebody had a line where they were describing, basically industrial capitalism as it was coming into its own, and saying that something of slavery still remains, something of freedom yet remains.
That's Ira Steward, and who is a fantastic figure as this pivot figure for the 19th century. He's the child of abolitionists, leader of the 8 Hours movement, and who wrote extensively about the need to regulate the hours of labor and to distribute work more equally so that nobody was forced to spend their entire lives working. But that quotation that you mentioned, which comes from one of his writings, is he says, "Something of slavery still remains, something of freedom is yet to come," which was his view about what labor looked like after the Civil War, and why he thought that the abolition of chattel slavery was an important advance, but didn't really complete the project of emancipation, because it turned out that industrial wage labor was characterized by its own forms of unfreedom. The most immediately obvious one was overwork. People working 12, 14, 16 hours a day for their entire lives, often dying early because of it. And which is why he thought that the only way for people to achieve freedom was collectively and democratically through democratic regulation of the economy. And the 8 hours laws were the kind of central sort of form of regulation that was meant to communicate and be a first step in this emancipation of labor from the kinds of unfreedom that one experienced in wage labor.
Yeah, which gets back to some of the point I was talking about with Rob about how if you think of freedom as being like, the kind of freedom or one of the kinds of freedom that's most important being our ability in practice to do what we want with our lives, to pursue, the projects that we want, to have different life outcomes, then certainly if you have to work, most of your waking hours, almost all of them, that obviously undermines that, right? I mean, that's a pretty good test case. But I do want to go back and start with Matt, right? So if we think about the movement against slavery, which is certainly the most the most successful movement ever against the most extreme form of unfreedom, that you can possibly imagine. It starts with those abolitionists who were just referred to, but it's won by the Republican, by the Republican Party winning an election, and then by the Union winning the Civil War, which is a slightly different thing. So this is something I've read you write about in the past, Matt. The way that sometimes with an eye towards current events parallels, like I've seen you use phrases like Abraham Lincoln's political revolution, talk about how the movement against slavery in that form that became successful was a mass movement from the grassroots of society that was directed, not just altruistically, there's certainly that, but against this idea that what they called the slave power was a threat to everybody's freedom. So can you just start to unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to start with the contemporary resonances, what's interesting is, I won't pretend that I wasn't looking for them, beginning to write this book and writing the article, the most substantial piece was published in Catalyst last winter. I can't pretend that I wasn't influenced by this moment, but, you go back and you find the phrases, the terminology, certainly the ideas bear, you don't have to look very hard. I mean, political revolution is a phrase that contemporaries used over and over and over again to talk about the Republican victory, meaning specifically, the sort of overthrow of an entrenched ruling class that had dominated Washington politics. In effect, incorporating both parties in the sort of two-party duopoly across the antebellum decades, for at least a generation. And the rise of the Republicans, the rise of an anti-slavery party meant, was understood as a political revolution because it wasn't simply like that, an underdog had won an election or something like that, but that this new formation, which was, in which anti-slavery was sort of stitched on the platform and to the banner of the party, and the mass politics of that election were all built around rallying ordinary Northerners against slavery, which I can talk about to some extent, or against the extension of slavery, against the future domination of slavery, against the rule of slaveholders in Washington, all those things. was a political revolution because of, in effect, the social consequences that it portended. That this new party had not only did not have any kind of loyalty or fealty toward the slaveholding class, which had really either dominated or at least significantly influenced both political parties, since the inception of the Union.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this vast Southern Empire, was about, right? Like that. This wasn't just some sort of like weird sectional, side interest. This was really like a dominant force in American politics.
Right, absolutely. They were, the slaveholding class in various guises, as Whigs, as Democrats, and as members of the political parties before the Whigs and the Democrats in the early republic, in one form or another, exercised at a minimum a kind of a brake power on the federal government, such that the federal government virtually never, as lots of historians have shown, either in foreign or domestic policy, exerted really any anti-slavery influence whatsoever. What anti-slavery that was meaningful, that existed for the first 80 years of the Republic, happened at the state level in the North. And that domination of the national political system only grew more intense across the mid-19th century, from the age of Andrew Jackson or so to the 1830s through until Republican victory in 1860. But to speak on the point that you raised at the beginning, I mean, another contemporary resonance is the effort that I argued in this Catalyst piece, but that I think characterizes a huge portion of the sort of Republican political mission, which is to sort of translate anti-slavery from a movement of activists, from a movement of kind of humanitarians and philanthropists, to a movement of mass politics in which, yes, not only the moral sensibilities, but the material needs and aspirations of ordinary Northerners were involved. And that's not to create a rigid distinction between those two things. Of course. That, in fact, it's the whole point is to fuse them together. And that's what, various, anti-slavery political ideas and concepts in rhetoric and in practice, kind of in political practice, attempted to do. Some of them were, some of those practices involved strikingly contemporary things like the mass rally, which existed, of course, before, but was really coming up to its own in the mid-19th century. And, Republicans had, in effect, anti-slavery mass rallies all over the North, in which, yes, they were intended to elect John C. Fremont or elect Abraham Lincoln, but they were really, their function was to propagandize the crimes and the danger of the slave power. And
yes,
another... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say,
you set me off on this. I'm like a wind-up.
No, go for it.
So please jump in and shut me down or direct the conversation.
Well, I was going to say, right, that I was hoping that you could get into this more, that like what danger they saw from the slave power to them.
Right. Well, the material end of it. For one, I think, and this may connect to the discussion about freedom and about the sort of question of self-government. For one, part of the critique was what we would identify today as a critique of minority rule, that this very tiny percent of the population somehow dominated far beyond its numbers and even far beyond its wealth. It dominated the political system in the South and then therefore through the nation. And again, another contemporary resonance, I make a lot of this, but it's sitting there right there in the congressional globe. William Steward, the foremost Republican of the 1850s probably, goes on about how slaveholders represent not 1/100th part of the population. He's literally calling them an antebellum 1%, about 300,000 slaveholders in a republic of 30 million. The math works out. It's like 1.5% maybe, if you say, 350,000 slaveholders. Anyway, so part of it is that this class is ruling the republic undemocratically and stifling the needs of the majority. So what are those needs materially in terms of 19th century material politics? Some of them are about the settlement of Western land. That's the most famous one. The kind of the extension of slavery to the West will end up reserving vast swaths of land for slaveholders as opposed to ordinary farmers. Yes, that gets into the question of settler colonialism, but bracket that for a minute. It has to do with tariffs and wages and how the political economy of slavery insisted on low tariffs and in effect, in some ways, low wages for Northern workers. It has to do with what the capacity of the federal government, where to build infrastructure, to build rivers and harbors, to build a Department of the Interior, internal improvements, but really, in effect, a version of universal public goods with with an activist federal government. These are things that weren't necessarily radical left programs, but but were being stifled by the slaveholding class as a way to sort of preserve its power over a delimited federal government. And all of these things under the Republican banner became the kind of way in which anti-slavery, by toppling the slave power, could speak both to the sort of very, very material and very concrete needs of Northern workers who were concerned about wages, about land, about internal improvements, and yet realize that the thing that was stifling, that was blocking all of these goods, was this also morally criminal slaveholding class that not by accident ruled through the extraction of other men's labor and other people's labor without their consent.
Yeah. So the concerns, there's the concern about wages. There's the concern about about government projects that can't be engaged in, because they conflict with the interests of this antebellum 1%. And a point that I remember Alex brought up in that Jacobin talk. So if either one of you want to speak to this, is that in some antebellum anti-slavery agitation, there's this kind of suggestion that I think is closely linked to that sort of democratic rhetoric about this being not 1/100th the population. That the habit of living in this way that's based on the extreme domination of others, slavery, actually makes it impossible to then relate to anybody else as an equal.
Yeah. So Matt gave a fantastic picture of the kind of material foundations of this conflict. And I think one thing that happens in the context of those conflicts is then a competition over how to think about what the material foundations are of freedom. So you have the slave owners, and the slaveocracy did tend to speak of themselves as the true defenders of freedom, but that's because they held on to a view that the freedom of some presupposed the unfreedom of others. So a self-governing republic requires a kind of class that is freed from the requirements of toil, that gets on with the business of government and democratic politics. And but you can only be emancipated from you can only be free in the relevant sense of being independent if there's someone else who isn't just working but doing the work for you. And the critics of slavery recognize, I think, that they couldn't just cede the ground of freedom to these reactionaries, as they were, that they had to actually expose this as a false notion of freedom and the false way of thinking about self-government, because they saw that what this actually led to was the cultivation amongst this 1% of the habits of domination, of beliefs about superiority, that freedom was realized in and through the domination of others, and that it meant that everybody was potentially subject to the rule and control of this small sect of truly fully independent and free individuals. And so the alternative, there were sort of two alternative ways of thinking about freedom. One was just this very individualized and individuated idea of the kind of peasant proprietor or landowner who sort of was off on the farm, didn't rely on anyone else's freedom, didn't rule over anyone else, just ruled oneself. But the one that really gets going, and it stood in an uneasy relationship, I think, to the slave owner's view of freedom. But the one that I think was most at odds, which you saw amongst abolitionists, amongst parts of the labor movement, amongst the kind of intertwining of abolitionism and the labor movement, was the idea that true freedom required not that there be some subject working class, but the elimination of a separate working class. That everyone had to participate as equals in creating the conditions that would allow everyone to enjoy the same kinds of freedoms, including freeing everyone from the need to work all the time. So if everybody cooperated as equals, then everyone could be freed from the maximum economic pressure. Everyone could enjoy a certain amount of leisure. Everyone could have enough time to cultivate themselves and the habits and knowledge necessary to participate in public life. And so true freedom meant not slavery, because that was false. It just led to the creation of these habits of domination, which were visible not just in the racial relations, but in the relationships between the slave-owning whites and the poor whites. But instead to a society based on equality, where everybody understood that the freedom that each enjoyed presupposed the freedom of everybody else. And I think it's the most powerful expression at the time of an alternative view, not just of freedom in the abstract, but of the material foundations of it, on an economy organized on the basis of collective democratic control over the economy that secures everybody from having to be overworked or subject to the control of bosses and so on. And I think it's a vision that's attractive to us today as a way of thinking through an alternative way of thinking about the material foundations of freedom, of the fact that you cannot really defend freedom without thinking about how the economy and especially labor is organized.
Yeah, and so of course that brings us to Rob's book. But first, I want to loop back a little bit, right? So because I think that oftentimes, talking about that initial anti-slavery mass movement emerging, which I guess is first expressed in the anti-slavery, as a mass movement, right? I mean, I guess first there's the anti-slavery wing of the Whigs, but then, like what you're talking about, Matt, is really then the emergence of the Republicans, and how that relates to some of this stuff that would come up later about labor and industrial capitalism. I think might seem a little unclear in a couple of different directions, or there are a couple of ways that maybe you could speak to that people could get this wrong, because on the one hand, there's the sort of idea that like it kind of doesn't, right? Like that if you want to just be like a really schematic Marxist about this, right? That's the you've got your bourgeois revolution that's maybe being fulfilled by the Civil War, and then that creates the possibility for something better, but that's like the only real relationship between those two things. And then on the other hand, I think there's kind of a tradition on parts of the left of like quoting some like Abraham Lincoln comments about labor and capital and stuff in a slightly misleading, out of context way. That
Little Sermons in Socialism by Abraham Lincoln did a little pamphlet distributed by the Socialist Party in like 1910. It had a bunch of these gems. Yeah.
Yeah. So where does Lincoln's Republican Party? I mean, if you're like, all right, we accept that probably in context, when he talks about labor and capital and stuff, he's actually not meaning to endorse, a proto-Marxist account of exploitation. But it's also not true that sort of concerns about the welfare of industrial workers are foreign to this movement and its stated motivations.
I'd love to hear Alex's take on this, but I can go first just from less about the economics, but maybe I can give a slightly historiographical version of that distinction, because I think there are arguments among historians about how to understand this. One way to put it is, just given the two speakers who've been featured thus far, how do you explain basically the gap between Seward and Steward? How do you get from a anti-slavery Republican Party that it seems to sort of embody a lot of the sort of the demand for a certain kind of positive liberty, or at least a critique of slavery's violation of that of that understanding of freedom, and then to a party that in the era of Ira Stewart in the Gilded Age period becomes the kind of most remorseless advocate of capital in the country. And then becomes the most enthusiastic capitalist party in the history of the world, as has been said. So yeah, I think historiographically there are basically as often is the case, there's arguments that emphasize continuity and arguments that emphasize change. And I think you don't have to be a kind of a total a totally vulgaroid Marxist to say there were elements of to trace a direct line from the kind of like bourgeois critique of slavery in the antebellum period that did flavor many anti-slavery critiques of bondage to the Gilded Age Republican Party. I mean, that's basically Eric Foner's interpretation in his classic work on pre-war Republican ideology. Now, I think it's multivocal, so I don't think he's a hardliner on this. I think there are lots of things you can read in Foner, much as there are lots of things you can read in the sources. But my view is that that this is a story of change, not continuity. This is a story of an ideology that clearly contained the seeds for many different forests. One that Alex has described very well in his book that does feed into labor republicanism in the late 19th century. But sure, that also contained, the seeds of, bourgeois, the sort of laissez-faire capitalism of the Gilded Age. But that what really happened is, the political economy of the nation changed between 1856 and 1880, or even 1876. And the rise of finance capital, there are, in Wall Street, not unrelated to the sort of need to finance the war, the kind of growing importance of industry and the sort of, and the power of the, the industrialist class, and the kind of the truth that in some ways Lincoln's vision of this kind of, democratic Republican, in effect, republic of petty proprietors was already out of date by the 1850s. No man should have to, should work a wage for life, Lincoln says, which is, quite a bold statement. We would love to hear, Bernie Sanders say that. That's far to the left of any, contemporary, on pure economics. Arguably, that's far to the left of any, contemporary left figure. And yet it was clearly not true by, in reality. And it became even less true in aspiration, but according to the policy of the Republican Party in power, even as soon as the 1860s. So there's a lot of part of my problem is I'm going to stop hemming and hawing here because I haven't actually carried that story with my own research through. This is part of my life's work now, is to try to figure out how this change happened. And first I have to write the book on the 50s, then I have to write the book on the 60s, then I have to write a book on the 70s. It's going to take a long time. But I think fundamentally this is a story of transformation and change, and a lesson that, that having a kind of the right ideological fusion for one moment doesn't necessarily, grant you a victory in another historical era. That's, most broadly what I would say, rather than, they were sheepdogged and poisoned from the beginning with this kind of evil germ of libertarianism that, doomed them, in the long run. But I suspect Alex agrees broadly, but I'd love to hear his take.
I agree almost entirely with what Matt says. I think that Lincoln articulates different ways of thinking about freedom depending on his audience. The most famous one is him speaking to a bunch of farmers in Wisconsin. So that's where he says labor is part of capital because labor produces capital. The ideal is a man begins a prudent, penniless beggar, works for wages a while, then goes off to buy his own land and becomes truly free. Right. So it's clear you have articulation. Wage labor is unfree. It should be a temporary condition. True freedom is control over your own labor. But he's talking to a bunch of farmers and articulating their ideal back to them, which isn't socialism. It's not. And it's not socialism because it's not an ideal of freedom in which the way each person becomes free is through the collective control over the process of labor. It's individuated. It's based on sort of small scale farming. And I think the really important thing, and, when Matt writes the book, then we get to find out how it happens, is that what Civil War achieves is abolition, but the meaning of abolition is indeterminate because it only tells you what you're negating, which is chattel slavery. But the contest was, what is it that you're putting in its place? What is freedom? It was just inadequate to say freedom is the absence of chattel slavery because there were a range of possible ways of organizing the economy. And the real question was, is freedom compatible with just owning your own capacity to labor such that you can make whatever labor contract you want? Or is it control over your own labor activity? And if it's control over your own activity, is it control through individual decisions about what you're going to do on your own plot of land? Or is it through collective control of an industrial process? So I think that Lincoln just doesn't have to directly confront those questions because he doesn't really live to see them be the central and dominant theme, which is what it really eventually comes post-war. I'll just say one little historiographical thing, which I know Matt knows too, which is that one of the people that Lincoln undoubtedly read for a decade before becoming president was Marx. Marx was one of the most consistent contributors to the New York Daily Tribune, which is basically the in-house paper of the Republican Party, and every major Republican politician would have been reading. And it was Marx, or occasionally ghostwritten by Engels. So a lot of the ideas wouldn't have just been in the air through native socialism, but would have just been there. And the kinds of ideas about freedom and free labor that were just sort of common discursive features of Republican ideology, but they were all mixed up because the conflict over different ways of thinking about what control and freedom meant in a in an industrial economy just hadn't fully developed. And so we can't, I think that's why, as Matt says, we can't exactly say it's neither predetermined that it was going to end up in a kind of libertarian ideology, nor was it secretly and truly socialist. I think other conflicts have to develop before we can understand more precisely what these different ways of thinking about freedom and control and labor really meant and who was on which side.
Yeah, and the period, I'll just add to that just quickly, in the period of the 1840s, 50s, the kind of ideological ooze between, Jeffersonian republicanism and kind of, Fourier and socialism is, really messy. And then, you throw in a kind of, what Horace Greeley called Whig socialism, too, which got a lot of love in that same paper in the 1840s, and you have all sorts of these strange correspondences that are misleading if you think of socialism and the Republican Party as being frozen in amber in say the 1890s. But the guy who named the Republican Party, Alvin Beauvais in Wisconsin,
right,
had been a communitarian socialist. So it is confusing. I mean, I think Alex's distinction is the critical one in terms of Lincoln's view about individual petty proprietorship versus, kind of collective decision making on the economy. And that's where, most of the kind of mainline Republicans never broke the seal on in their kind of public politics on that kind of Jeffersonian individualistic kind of vision. But it is sort of important to remember, and as a that's not there's not a straight line between that and kind of Reaganism either. It's a deeply egalitarian vision, in my view. It's obviously racialized and dependent on all sorts of land theft and problematic in lots of ways, but it has a kind of egalitarian aspiration at its core that I think is very different from libertarianism, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to Alex talk about that, I mean, something that hit me is that there is like a weird little echo of that view that Lincoln is presenting to the farmers that you get in contemporary right-wing politics. I'm sure, like Rob as a lefty, economist, I'm sure you run into this, not necessarily from economists, but just from like ordinary people, which is that people will say things like, well, sure, you can't live on the minimum wage, but that's not supposed to be, something you can live on, right? That's not supposed to be for, adults who are supporting families. This is supposed to be like entry level, early stuff that, which of course is in the contemporary context, like really delusionally, disconnected, from how the economy actually works. But there's like a little, there is like an interesting little hint there of that same, in Lincoln's case, not necessarily a concession to socialism, but from that same maybe common starting point that you might have with socialists. Obviously much stronger in Lincoln's case, because I think even people who say it about the minimum wage don't really think that everybody's going to get to be a small proprietor someday. They just think that you're going to have a better job, but you're at least conceding that it would be unreasonable in some way to expect people to live their entire lives like this, in the same way that Lincoln's way of presenting this is conceding this like extremely radical thing, as Alex says, way to the left of anything that, Bernie or any of those people would say now, right? Which is that it's that you're fundamentally unfree if you are living your entire life as a wage laborer.
Yeah, and it's real interesting too because despite how much these parties, like you guys are saying, have completely transformed over the intervening century and a half. I mean, like a lot of these same patterns are still there, and that's fascinating. What Alex was saying, I always think one of the most interesting things is seeing how like different kinds of elite people sort of rationalize their power or their system of rule. It's always just kind of a little interesting thing. And that's really interesting. I got to say, I got to read these books. This is pretty juicy stuff. But it seems even up to today, when you look at powerful people or conservatives who don't want big government or taxation or regulation or redistribution or whatever it is, it's always like, well, that intrudes on my freedom. What about my freedom to decide what my workers will pay or what humiliating terms I'll employ them under? It's always like these people always say, well, I'm pro-freedom. I believe in freedom, like my freedom to do all these things. And so one thing, we look at a little bit in the history of this is that idea of hegemonic freedom. Like, yes, if you're a king and you can decide who lives and who gets their head cut off today, well, that's a lot of freedom for you. You're free to decide who lives and who dies. How exciting. But of course, that's just a naked abuse of power over every other human in your fiefdom or whatever it is. So it's interesting because that same sort of, like these slave owners are saying like, well, real freedom is you concede your will and your life to us, at least, you not white people who don't have the ability to have, yes, the Jeffersonian independent agrarian ideal that we pretend that we're striving for. So this is real freedom, is me having power over you. That's incredible because that has not changed, at least. I mean, now it's just a straight capitalist dystopia century and a half later, but it's impressive how much that same sort of rationalization still happens. And also get to what Matt was saying about, that is funny. You always see those sort of distorted seeming or decontextualized Lincoln quotes, which are impressive. I mean, they show you how much people took for granted, like the dignity and role of labor, at least at that time. Although, like any other political figure, probably varying depending on the audience that he's speaking to. But I always think of like a figure from this era who speaks to this stuff is, the escaped slave and great self-taught public intellectual Frederick Douglass, who's so great that even our wonderful president is vaguely aware of him. So,
more and more people are talking about him.
He's going to be in the Garden of Heroes. If they
he's going to be the Garden of Heroes along with Reagan. I mean, it's what a brain scramble.
Davy Crockett. I think Harriet Tubman's in there too.
Harriet Tubman,
they can finally be honored because they're next to
everyone that you learn about in about third grade. That's who made the cut.
And then some random right-wing pilot who became an actor or something like that. There was like this totally obscure
equal dignity levels, like very comparable, similar figures. But I just like Frederick Douglass, who I think we can say was, if you look at what he said about these systems, I think there's a little bit less, at least, of a concern about, stripping the context or taking the words too much at face value, which is always something, especially with political figures who are campaigning, you have to think about. But Douglass, I mean, he made the point that experience demonstrates there may be a slavery of wages, only a little less galling and crushing in its effects than chattel slavery, and the slavery of wages must go down with the other. That's fighting words. That's more than, labor and dignity. This is only somewhat more dignified than one of the great crimes against humanity from someone who ought to know. Like, these are the things you should be throwing in your dumb family members' faces this Thanksgiving and stuff.
Which is fun too, because one of the charges, I mean, actually, Alex, you wrote an article about this for Jacobin, when it came out in this last election cycle that Bernie Sanders had once in the past used the phrase wage slavery, and it never really got legs, but for like a couple days, there was this thing where a lot of liberals were being outraged about that because that was like trivializing slavery. So, so that's an interesting question, right? Is Frederick Douglass, trivializing slavery? You wouldn't think
tell
so.
it to him. Yeah.
I mean, so many people said it, like Frederick Douglass, Lucy Parsons, Eugene Debs. I mean, it's such a common, it's so widespread as a thing to say. I mean, I think that, and maybe this is I think this is sort of on this, but it's that it's not just that it was a common thing to say, but as you trace out the argument about wage slavery, it's interesting to see who consistently says it. I mean, in a way, Lincoln is important because he's pretty much the last president to take it in any way seriously as something that you can say publicly. And that's because he had to weave together the emancipatory coalition that Matt was talking about. I mean, it was a coalition of sort of Northeastern industrial interests, financial interests, Western farmers, some workers. And so you had to articulate the competing ideas of all of them. But after that, and I think this is what I think is baked into the Republican Party is the class structure of it. It is still, in the end, a party controlled by the northern bourgeoisie. And that puts just a hard limit on how far this kind of idea could go. And it's why the critique of wage slavery becomes almost entirely an argument you find outside the major parties, and something articulated as a kind of vision or critique of unfreedom that is largely the property and feature of independent left-wing movements. So for me, what's baked in is not some kind of logical progression in how you have to think of freedom, but the limits that certain kinds of class structures within parties put on how far you can go with the idea. And so I think the story of the Republican Party after Lincoln is just a story of why, to really get the full emancipatory vision, you need an independent working class party able to impose its own hegemonic vision upon its party and articulate that as a fully throated, fully developed vision of a free economy. And that's really what the problem is, and why the Republican Party can become so pretty quickly, not just a kind of right-wing party, but a party then for people who are setting up paramilitary organizations to assassinate labor leaders. 20 years after after the Civil War, they've already started doing this. The major figures in the Republican Party, investing in armories in major cities so that the National Guard and police can go in and engage in extremely violent strike suppression among workers who are articulating these very ideas. It's a feature of the kind of material limitations on how far those elements of the Republican Party could ever go.
Yeah, and to that point, I have to take the continuity punch here, because it's in the span of not just a potential lifetime, but the actual lifetimes of many Civil War soldiers like William McKinley and James
Pinkerton.
Garfield and what?
Pinkerton, the founder of the Pinkerton organization, he's a Civil War veteran.
Absolutely. All these guys fought the war to destroy the slaveholders' rebellion and the War of Emancipation, and the greatest left-wing revolution in American history, quote unquote. And yet were, literally later, just a few years down the road in their own lives, kind of militarizing, the Northeast to defend capital. So, I agree with Alex about the class coalition. I do think it's hard to sort of figure out when that balance of power shifted, because it's despite the fact that, basically Northeastern producers were always, central and important to the Republican Party from its origin, to anti-slavery politics, frankly, from its origin. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens was a small factory owner, in southern Pennsylvania, but the way the kind of basic class politics of that group in the 1840s and 50s was a lot more ambiguous than by the 1870s and 80s. And it punched a little bit below its weight in comparison to the sort of farmer worker element of the party, especially in the West and in New England was still very prominent, so of course the other famous
rallies, it's not mass rallies of factory owners.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if you're bringing like 20,000 people to like Beloit, Wisconsin, or Massillon, Ohio, or these like tiny hamlets. I mean, these are numbers that like Trump would be jealous of today. And the other famous episode too,
much lower population.
Yeah, exactly. Tiny, far, much harder to do travel, et cetera, et cetera. You're talking about half, the whole, population of multiple counties in these tiny towns. Anyway, there's also the other famous episode is Lincoln at the shoemaker's strike in Lynn, right? Where in 1860, where he's still kind of making, and historians parse those words, and some people think, oh, he's just basically saying, you have the right not to be enslaved. But I think even most cautious interpretations say that he means a lot more than that, and he's willing to sort of embrace at this point a vision of what the positive content of free labor that involves some degree of worker organization and at least a balance of power between labor and capital that is unimaginable, even frankly 10 years later. And that does, I think, reflect the kind of change of balance of power within the coalition. This is one reason why I'm so interested in the kind of class coalition of our current party system too.
I mean, totally. The stuff that Matt's been doing on the midterm elections and these elections, like breaking down where the shifts are, it's like, it's this stuff people think is somehow just like nitty gritty, boring, whatever. But it's like, these are the details that tell you exactly what the foundations are of who's going to be able to impose their control on the party. And if what you're doing is swinging professional class and middle class suburbs, then we know who's going to be winging, because it's just beholden to those kinds of shifts. But I think and the analogy, I think this is why, you mentioned Foner's been doing this forever. The book on Reconstruction is that it's really Reconstruction that I think tells the tale. It's when a lot of the ambiguities can no longer remain ambiguous in the Republican Party, because you get more industrial labor militancy, you get the massive strikes on the railroads in 73, 74, and the Reconstruction itself is really dangerous to the northern property interests, because you've basically said for slaves to be free, it's not enough just for them to no longer be chattel slaves. We have to seize the property of the slave owners and give it to the slaves by force so that they can be free. And only if they've got 40 acres and a mule, only if they've got land so they can control themselves rather than have to go back and work for the damn plantation owners again, can they really be free. And once you've introduced the principle that freedom requires seizing property so everybody can have some, so they're not dependent on property owners, that's a serious threat to property owners everywhere. And it was, I think, the moment that starts to make a lot of that fluidity suddenly turn into ice, and the cracks start to form.
The Nation magazine denouncing socialism in South Carolina. Yeah.
Well, it's a constitutional. This is dictatorship of the proletariat, except this is dictatorship of the Republican Party. The people are outside. They don't enjoy the full rights because you need basically a legal power to coercively expropriate their property and give it to the people who ought to have it if they're going to be free.
The South Carolina's black majority legislature, contemplated basically, welfareist policies based on taxation, then, the Northeastern elites start to scream about socialism and that this is going to impact what impacts the property owning class of the South is going to, impact the property owning class of the North. That's why W.B. Du Bois called it a counter-revolution of property.
It's interesting to think about what would be an analogous moment in the U.S. now that would sharpen and clarify the class structure of the Democratic Party in those ways. What's the South Carolina Martinsburg strike kind of moment such that it's just suddenly
naked,
made vivid and clear? If there's an analogy, sometimes these analogies are useless, but in the sense that it suddenly clarified a conflict within the Republican Party that had been sort of suppressed. I don't know what the analogous one would be. The fact is there isn't really that kind of conflict right now.
Yeah, I'm guessing it would come down to, it would probably be something, it would be another labor-based struggle where you would see, or something that would affect basically, property values of suburbanites, or potentially some kind of progressive taxation plan at the state level that, where you see those same kind of class-based splits about who's willing to pay and who isn't. It is complicated because some people will tell you that the basically suburban professional class has a different, political economic position and character and thus ideology than the, small business owning class, which is, true, but I still am skeptical about its potential as a vehicle for transformation and liberation.
Yeah, right. These are people who, and I had Crystal Ball on, I thought she put it well, she was talking about the, sort of Virginia, DC suburbs, where she used to live, be like, all right, a lot of these people, if you polled them on economic issues, they would give you a lot of the answers that you'd want, right? They would say, oh yeah, sure, we should have, universal
healthcare,
minimum wage is too low, whatever. The question is, are they ever going to prioritize any of this stuff, push comes to shove?
Right. And priorities are politics, basically, within the coalition. There was a survey that Bhaskar Sankar sent me the other day about basically that just disaggregates this, like where voters are, given a 20 options about like their political priorities, and like working class voters overwhelmingly always say healthcare, jobs, healthcare, jobs, the economy. And professional class voters overwhelmingly say, basically, they say the environment, race relations, and healthcare. Like healthcare is the one place where you can, at least now, you can kind of thread a little bit of a needle, although not necessarily, it's still limited.
Once you start getting into the nitty gritty, I mean, there is a reason.
Then that falls apart too. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why. I mean, and this relates to your, is it the Patagonian road to socialism? Why this can't be a base for radical transformation. Why during the primary, Elizabeth Warren started to back off from her earlier on ambiguous support for Medicare for all, and started trying to to sort of triangulate about it in a slightly strange way, because a lot of the people who really formed her support base kind of liked it, but they also started to get a little bit nervous that their premium healthcare plans were going to be taken away under single payer.
Yeah, and you have to pay for it. I mean, in some ways, it does come down to that same kind of basically fiscal question that and this is what people on the right center will say in response to the kind of data for progress type polling that I think jibes with what Crystal says in a kind of dark way, that all these things poll well, but then when you actually have to institute the fiscal regime that's going to actually pay for them, that's going to actually do the redistributive part rather than just the free goods for the poor part, then it's hard. And yes, some parts of the left, the modern monetary crew, and like other people would say, well, the deficits don't matter. And I'm I'm not a fiscal hawk. But if there's going to be redistribution at some point, it does have to involve taking some more from the rich and moving it around.
This is where I actually think the stuff that Rob's book about sort of capitalism and freedom and sort of stuff about reclaiming freedom really matters, because I think the professional class resistance to that fiscal policy isn't just I want to keep my money so I can have my house and whatever. It's that they think they worked for it, that this is theirs, that they, in some ways, the professional class, because they went through, they worked hard in high school, they got into college, then they worked throughout college and they went and got some advanced degree, that what they have is what they deserve, and that it's a violation of their freedom to take their money, and that it's a disruption of their life plans. It's not just a constraint on the marginal consumption they've lost. It's a disruption of their life plans and a violation of their own shaping of their own life. And in that way, I something I really came to appreciate is just how hegemonic a certain right-wing view about freedom and personal responsibility really is. And Corey Robin and I wrote this piece called Reclaiming Freedom, and it was about how the right reclaimed freedom over the course of the 20th century from the left, and in particular figures like Hayek, by trying to say, look, the left was wrong for thinking freedom was about becoming free from the economy, being freed from having to spend your whole life worrying about your needs. It's about being freedom in and through the economy, but only if people are subject to the discipline of the market. And so to be really free, you have to be subject to discipline of market, because then you're responsible for your own choices. That's the kind of crude recharacterization. And I think, if you think of the Clinton years and the whole language of personal responsibility, welfare reform was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act or something like that. And this is, and it's deeply linked to the ideas of meritocracy. Obama talking about, if I can be here, if I can be president, anybody can be, so long as you work hard. All the crazy Obama knots tutored poor kids in the DC area to try and instill in them this kind of ethic that if you just work hard enough, you too can succeed. And that has now become a very widespread view that you have created your fate through how you have managed the economy. And it's I think, a deep, semi-conscious but powerful source of resistance to these fiscal foundations that Matt was just talking about. To tax policy. It's not just the loss of consumption. It's like, oh, I won't be able to go on the vacation I wanted to go on, or maybe it'll be harder for me to get my kids through college. I think it's like they see it as a violation. And
that's a really good point.
And I think that's the real problem. And what was so pernicious about the Clinton and Obama years in particular, because it sunk that view so deep into the mainstream respectable kind of kind of opinion.
There's a liberalism that's entirely about meritocracy, right? This is the Thomas Frank, not the new book, but the previous one, Listen Liberal. What it's all about. This sort of version of liberalism, replacing New Deal liberalism that really sees like defines social injustice as unfair barriers to meritocracy. If somebody can't build up all of that through their hard work or whatever because of racism or homophobia or something else, then that's a social justice issue. But if people are just living in poverty or are become unemployed due to outsourcing or whatever, that's like a natural event, like an earthquake. That's just the economy doing what the economy does.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting point, Alex. I enjoyed that article you wrote with Corey Robin back there, because like all through the Cold War era, like with the New Deal period, like you had at least a wing of the Democrats willing to say, well, yes, we make a shared sacrifice so we can go to the moon and we can have the Great Society. Like, it was at least a presence in the political debate, and so it was in people's minds. But that's really true. Like with the New Democrats and Clinton, and especially Obama. Like now, I think a lot of otherwise sort of vague liberal, probably more meritocratic, sympathetic voters now, like we're just so unaccustomed to being called upon to make like a shared sacrifice that actually, it does come down to, as Matt said, like a real, like there'll be a fiscal bite to this, like there'll be a tax bite. And of course, we naturally want like serious progressive taxation, like bring back the progressive grades in the income tax, like corporate tax or a wealth tax, things like that real progressive structure. You may be surprised how much we can fund with that. But if we want things like a Green New Deal, like a little more ambitious than Medicare for all, like there's no question that we won't all, broadly, maybe not, we would have a much broader tax increase on some level. And of course, a lot of people, like you're saying, like do have that basic recognition that, well, I don't mind paying taxes. We got to pave the roads. We need schools that my kids don't go to, but others do. Like there is some respect for that. But as soon as that higher tax bill comes, like that really is where the rubber hits the road, and people need to have some sort of ideological preparation for the idea that, yes, you will actually have a higher tax bill in the spring, or a bigger withholding in every paycheck, so we can fund this stuff. So many tens of millions, fairly conservative Americans were willing to accept that because that idea was in the regular political discussion. Like now, it's absolutely right. That's completely lost. And that's why, I don't know, when I talk to my activist buddies and stuff, I always feel like there's a strong, especially like the younger, kids that I teach, I feel like there's a strong drive where people want to go out and do a big action, and we got to do a climate action or a action in defense of Black lives. And I'm all for this stuff, but I feel like sometimes we forget like that huge role that the education has to play, political education, before you can organize people, make them see why they need to organize, or do a big risky action that blocks traffic and pisses off blue collar people. If everyone doesn't already know what the issue is and sort of have at least some sympathy with it, it's really tough to do that stuff. That's why whenever I am trying to get my goofy family members to contribute to do their charitable giving, whatever, I'm always trying to get them to pitch it toward independent and especially leftist media like Jacobin and Current Affairs, because like that is the boring preparation that has to come before you can organize 1 million people to stop traffic and demand climate action. But it is, we've lost so much of that. It's rough.
Yeah, and I think that what you're talking about resistance to resistance to the funding part, which of course there is an education component, because this is hegemonic, right? It doesn't just influence people whose financial interests really are adversely affected by this overall, but but it is important to take on, and I think you can see even in activist efforts in the last few years, the effects even on the left of how hegemonic some of that stuff that Alex was talking about is, because you think about Bernie Sanders, certainly that there were various points in which he accepted the sort of thing that Obama always did, right? That, I'm not going to touch any tax rates under whatever the $250,000 or whatever. He didn't for every issue, but he did for some issues, and even arguably in the post George Floyd unrest, when there was all this emphasis on defunding the police, which I'm not against. I mean, I think if your local police department, has so much, has the kind of budget that can be used to buy tanks, then that can be, I'm certainly not against taking that away from them. But I think that the emphasis on it might indicate a eagerness to try to avoid that conflict about funding, because because there's a sort of implication that, well, actually, not even an implication. Like, I remember there was a AOC tweet over the summer where she was talking about taking various city services that need to be funded more, and she was relating to police defunding and said, "Oh, we found the budget line." And I wrote a piece for Jacobin about this, saying, "Well, no, you didn't." Right? Like, if you took away every cent from the NYPD, which is one of the most lavishly bloated, police departments in the world, you would not even be able to close the funding gaps between the poorest and richest schools in New York City. There is no there is no way to get local social democracy without actually increasing a lot of people's taxes by a lot.
Yeah, and I'm Alex. I'm so struck by your insight there, which I think is actually goes really deep. That it's not even about necessarily the tax bill or about that marginal cost, but that it's ideological, and that it's about, and that in some sense it's not even a question of like, oh well, then this bite is gonna, when I see this on my bill, I'm gonna revolt. It's more about, I think this is maybe what I would connect it to is another legacy of the Clinton Obama era, is this sort of derogation of the public sphere, and the kind of understanding that the private world is where efficiency and happens, and where things happen. And so because I think there's also related to that sense of like losing additional income, being constrained by this like big grabby state that wants to do things, is the sense that it won't even work. That, and I think you're seeing that like in Illinois. I mean, there's some mixed verdicts on this, but Illinois voters, even though they, are voted blue 60-40, and they're not at all very, not particularly progressive billionaire governor was out there flogging a progressive income tax, to sort of save the state budget, which is about to implode, as a sort of last hope for Illinois. And voters rejected it. And I'm persuaded, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm persuaded that it's largely on the basis, it's related to Alex's insight, but it's also connected to this idea that the sort of state government of Illinois is not competent or capable of actually, enhancing anything with this additional funding. And so that my zone of responsibility is, that money is better with me, even if services fail. And then, of course, it's a doom loop where more services fail, and, and the sort of, the quid pro quo is not quid pro quo. What is the Latin line, Ben? Help me. The syllogism, I guess, is proved, that if this, then that, and it becomes a circle of syllogisms, yeah. and everyone loses out. And I mean, I worry that ideology still runs pretty deep in the Democratic Party of Obama, Biden, in that you still see real expertise, real efficiency, real know-how always is going to come from the private sector, especially now the new tech the tech world. I mean, how many of the new Biden staffers that we just saw appointed have all these, corporate backgrounds? They're the only people that know how to run anything. They're the only people that know how to do anything. And it really becomes this, I think in some ways that element is almost harder than the pure fiscal bite element to convince people that Medicare for all can actually work. And frankly, I think that's a problem for working class voters too. I think working class voters at this point are not convinced broadly that the public sphere can do anything for them, which is a bigger problem even than the sort of suburban personal freedom.
Although how much of that is because they think that it wouldn't if it were implemented, and how much of it is just because they think that it wouldn't be implemented? Like I know like a common critique, like people thinking about like why Labour, lost the last general election, in the UK as badly as it did. And it seems like a lot of their policy proposals were individually popular, but I think maybe some voters hear what sounds like this long, elaborate Christmas wish list of like wonderful reforms that could happen, and they just don't take it seriously. They don't think any of that stuff's going to happen.
But don't you think
that's real?
I think that's because they can tell that it's a setup for the state to do things for them, but a state that isn't theirs. So it's not when they actually control. So, for instance, the problem for Labour was that they had, the majority had voted for Brexit. Labour Party was against Brexit. So for all of the stuff that they said, we're doing this for you, they knew that when they had actually articulated a will and acted on it, Labour Party wasn't ready to listen to them. And I think it's a similar problem in the US, which is you might have a state that says it's going to do things for you, but it's not yours because the party isn't yours. And people want these to be, I think people can tell when they're in control and when they're not. I think that it's the kind of problem for the Democratic Party is it's ready to do things for workers, but on terms defined by the Democratic Party. So the order of priorities, the urgency of the needs, the people actually making the decisions are not going to be things determined directly by working class voters, because it's not a working class party, So I think that Matt's right about that, and actually hadn't thought about it until Matt said it. But there's since the Clinton years, there's been something, and even a bit earlier, it's been something very weird about the Democratic Party, which is that it has been the agent both that claims to be the party of competency and competent administration, and the party explaining to everybody the limits on what the state can do. And this kind of is that it's incompetent, and especially incompetent in precisely the spheres when people might want the most intervention, mass provision of universalistic entitlements and welfare services, but super competent when it comes to, coming up with the most targeted possible sort of, urban renewal scheme or managing the Fed or whatever. So I hadn't thought about it until Matt had put it quite that way, but and I think that it just communicates to everyone who's really in control.
Yeah, and this question of who's in control is good. And this is kind of what I'd like to get back to in the last few minutes, because something that we talked about earlier, but I'd like to kind of, put a bow on, maybe go through one last time a little more slowly, is this idea, something you talk about a lot, Alex, this small r Republican notion of freedom, which is related to that kind of positive freedom that Rob was talking about earlier. Which is the idea that freedom should be understood not just in that sort of like narrow libertarian way of freedom from coercion, and not even just in terms of, your right to do certain things, but in terms of this kind of conception that's bound up in civic participation, where the analogy is with these ancient republics, Greece and Rome, which is why the pro-slavery version of it says, in ways that we talked about earlier, that, well, look, you wouldn't have had, everybody in Athens wouldn't have had time to do all that direct democracy stuff if they hadn't had a slave class. You need some people to be unfree so others are truly free. And the in the anti-slavery version, in the later Labor Republican version, says no. Some people have, habits of domination, that they're not going to be able to relate to others as equals. You need everybody to be free in order to truly have this, so they can relate to each other as political equals, and they can be and they can. Maybe we can reduce working hours so everybody has time to to fully participate, and I think that maybe the sort of more optimistic way to look at your insight from earlier, and maybe Matt, you can get on this at the end, is is that, okay, so even when people have that sort of resistance to taxation to fund social programs, not just because of the bite, right, like Alex was saying, but because they think it interferes with their life plans, it interferes with a certain kind of substantive freedom, what they've built up for themselves, which is sort of the modern equivalent, the sort of professional class equivalent of what Abraham Lincoln is talking about as the ideal of freedom is, okay, maybe you have to be a wage laborer for a while, but then you get to be a small farmer, and you're truly free. So I think that actually reflects something that might be optimistic, right? That like there might be something you can take from this that would actually be good for the left, which is to think that, look, ultimately what really moves most people the most is not this sort of legalistic libertarian idea of freedom. Because look, the people that you're talking about, the professional class people who are resistant to taxation, they're not taxationist theft people. That's not their beef with this. Their beef with this is that they think it stops them from being able to pursue the sorts of lives that they built for themselves and they should be able to build for themselves, and that are tied into their status in society. And I think that there might be a way to build on that, not in a way that's marketed towards the professional class, because as Matt has laid out, that's not ever going to be, a reliable base, for this kind of social program, but in a way that's targeted to the working class. Say, hey, look, we want everybody, right, to be able to have some control over their life outcomes, and that's the basis for our politics. So there's a question from a patron, which I'll just quickly paraphrase before I throw this back to Matt, which was roughly about like how a sort of good left-wing way of understanding freedom can be used in future electoral politics. So Matt, maybe you could speak to any element of that, right? Either the sort of nuts and bolts electoral takeaway, or the sort of broader idea that there is something here that, even though it has reactionary versions, does show that the sort of vision of freedom that we'd want is one that, I think people are going to find intuitively appealing.
Yeah, I actually think probably Rob and Alex would have better ideas about how to, sort of at the theoretical level, about how to sort of, build positive freedom into sort of slogans and ideas that people feel speak to them and can use, that they can use. I guess I would say I wanted to sort of respond to this, to what Alex said about, or what we were all talking earlier about, basically about competence and meritocracy, and where that ideology is taking us, and how that relates to this question of freedom. I think, because on one level you are beginning to see at least a kind of academic intellectual revolt against meritocracy. Like you're starting to see a new spate of books, and it hasn't totally sort of trickled down yet, if that's the kind of intellectual theory of diffusion that we're using here. But I mean, it started at Yale, and I will see if it gets to Syracuse soon. I don't know, but there are awful lot of Ivy League professors talking about how meritocracy is a disease, which everyone can point out the irony of that. But I do wonder what to make of that, and where that will go, and if not to sort of go against all the writing that I've been doing for years about pessimism about the professional class as a vehicle. But I do wonder if there is an ideological opening to sort of go after, not just to go after the sort of minimum of sort of fiscal redistributive point, but to go after the ideological fortress of personal responsibility. Because I actually think if you put it on paper, I don't think meritocracy is very popular as an idea. I think it's popular when it's intuited and when it's kind of talked around. I don't think it's popular when it's actually explicated, when it's actually like laid out, because it's so profoundly inegalitarian, and it's so remorselessly, in effect, kind of cruel and undemocratic. I'm higher than you because I'm better than you. It's far more savage than even a kind of even in some ways a sort of Gilded Age capitalism, where it might be because you had a lucky you had an uncle or a father-in-law that gave you a leg up, or maybe you just worked harder. That meritocracy is almost deeper than that, because it's about the sort of some sort of essence, some kind of quiddity within you that has given you the good things of this world. I do actually, maybe I'm outing myself as another deluded Ivy League professor who's criticizing meritocracy, but I actually do think that there are some ideological legs there to sort of not just critique the word, but to really take a battering ram to that idea, and the extent to which it pervades, and it shows up in all sorts of different ways in the kind of the cult of saying, the cult of believing in science, which is, just absolutely, an outrageous insult to like to say that if you don't vote for the party that I like, you don't believe in science. Do we understand how condescending and idiotic that sounds, frankly? Even though, and I'm not denying that there are plenty of people who, we can have disagreements about, I'm not denying COVID or something like the YouTube boxer, but I'm saying, but I do think that putting this kind of cult of meritocracy, expertise, professional know-how, putting that under the microscope and squashing it as best we can in our little mini function as intellectuals, I think that's as important as any of the kind of fiscal or economistic arguments about our policy, because I think that ideological fortress is the one that we need to storm.
This, by the way, I really like that. And this, by the way, Matt, is where we can definitely say that Lincoln was more radical than any of the contemporaries, because meritocracy is linked to a specific conception of equality of opportunity or freedom, which is that everyone should be equally free to compete for scarce positions of power and privilege. And the 20% that happen to win that competition become the meritocracy, and the 80% just get the rest, the shitty fucking whatever's left in the economy. Whereas Lincoln's view was that of equality of opportunity was fundamentally non-competitive. He just said, so long as everyone works hard enough, everyone should be able to attain the same condition of independence. That's the whole point of that famous quote. It is intragenerational. It's not like your children or your children's children might someday get to go to college. It's that if that prudent penniless beggar works hard enough, they should be able to not have to spend their entire life working for wages. And it's a radically different understanding of what the kinds of opportunities ought to be that are available to people, and a very different understanding, therefore, of freedom. Everybody who works hard enough should be able to attain some position in society that allows them to develop some talents and achieve a position of respect and status, which is the opposite, as Matt said, of the meritocracy.
The right to rise, which is the name of Jeb Bush's super PAC, comes out of Lincoln's phrase, that same Lincoln speech. The right to rise. That's a great point, Alex. It's a universal right, right to rise. It's not a right for the cream to rise and the rest to sink, or the wheat to rise and the chaff to sink. It's a universal right. That's powerful. I've got to run, guys. I've got to do baby stuff. But I really enjoyed chatting with you guys. This has been really stimulating.
I'm excited to. I'm happy that you said that. I'm excited that you're doing the 19th century Rick Perlstein thing and doing a book about each decade. That's going to be fun.
So. Pray for me. I haven't. It's been hard lately, but I got to get back. I'm getting off Twitter, and I'm going to get back into the archives.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Matt.
Bye, guys.
Nice to see you, Matt.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. So in the that's interesting. In the last few minutes before David Griscom comes on and we wrap this up, I am curious to sort of hone in a little bit more on that last question about how the left today could be better at weaponizing, a better conception of freedom and the rhetoric of freedom. If either one of you guys want to jump in on that.
Yeah, it is tough because it's such a absurdly lopsided political and media landscape. These days, Sheldon Ellison and David Koch, like that money goes to promote, to buy ads for PragerU on YouTube and Facebook. Like it is a tilted landscape in general, but I kind of the way I think of it is, you do have like sort of a core group of fairly shallow on today's right. It's a long time since William Buckley. But you do have like a core group of ideas, like meritocracy is a big one, like the free market is another one. It is a cluster of ideas and they all should be, attacked and destroyed. So I don't think there's any like particular one way to do it. But I mean, to me, just the basic of it is just building up that independent media. And I mean, that might be more of like a political strategic idea than an intellectual one, but just being able to reach people regularly with some some other way of viewing the world that's not limited by cable news limits of discussion is it's pretty important. And as far as freedom itself, the one thing I always say to people is, I teach. I'm an economist and I teach in a business program, like many economists, sadly. And there, you have so many students. Like every student wants to start their own business and have their own little company that does this or that. I think it's great. These are young people. I don't want to just immediately crush their dreams if I can avoid it. One thing I always got to tell them is well, it's tough, it's good if you can have a spouse or a family member who's working full time for some corporate bastard so you can get your health insurance. Things like the more achievable progressive policy goals of today, like Medicare for all. In my experience, it's kind of pretty doable to connect that, which again, is a positive freedom issue. You should be entitled to health care if we can easily afford it, which of course we can. You can tie that to wouldn't you be a lot more free to start your business and see if it can work and experiment as a business if you didn't have to worry about not having health care for the entire period until some business succeeds enough that you can get a nice group rate from some scumbag insurance network. To me, there's and obviously that's a very near-term strategic sort of use of the idea, but I've found that if it makes business students think twice, there must be something there.
Yeah, I'm sort of you're making me thankful that I don't have to teach business school students, Rob. I think that the problem faces the left is there isn't a particularly coherent left that's really committed to what used to be the traditional left commitments to human emancipation as the core point of the project that could carry these ideas forward. And there isn't a kind of organized and sustained mass struggle that could be interpreted as an expression of this desire for self-determination. And so it isn't clear what to do. I just don't think it's obvious, given the absence of kind of independent left-wing politics and ideology on the one hand, and of a kind of mass struggle that already articulates that kind of demand. Not just people occasionally out in struggles, not local strikes, but something more like the kind of workers' movement that sustained these ideas, for a century and a half. So that's I think the limits. It's not the most exciting thing to say to the question, the person who wrote the question, but I think it's the truth that can't be forgotten anytime you say anything positive. What I will say is there are things, though, that the left could do better than it does. So one is, just without question, consistently and continuously doing things like defending democracy. And I don't just mean being ready to go out on the streets and kind of fight for it when it looks like it might be under the mostly phantom attacks by Trump or something like that. But I mean things like always defending majority rule, having a sustained and developed critique of the institutions and apparatus of counter-majoritarian rule. So, for instance, one of the oddities of Sanders, for instance, was for all that he talked about a political revolution, there was no deep institutional analysis of what made the United States undemocratic. There was no sustained critique of the Supreme Court and judicial review, no real critique of the Senate, for that matter. There was nothing about getting rid of the Electoral College. None of the... What's that?
To really sharpen that, he wasn't even against the filibuster.
Yeah. And so, he was a longtime senator who's used the apparatus of the Senate to kind of get little bits and pieces of legislation through. But it just struck me that it wasn't even a feature of Sanders. It wasn't like he had to suppress the articulation of that kind of radical demand for just majority rule. It just isn't anywhere there. Isn't really much there on the left. And I think it's a place to start. I think other things are really important, like the defense of mass strikes, and other kinds of mass social organizations for self-determination. But I tend to think that the reason I'm hesitant about those things is that there's plenty of discussion of things like mass or general strike in certain sects of the left, but they're more flights of fancy. You can't kind of conjure those things into existence. Yeah, those kinds of things happen when there's already major demands for self-determination among large segments of the working class. So I think the problem we face is just the fact that those kinds of mass democratic movements within the working class have been winnowed down, and what's left is the limited institutional apparatus of democracy itself. And so I would think that's a place where you start.
Yeah, I mean, if you start with 6.7% private sector unionization and say, oh, we need a general strike,
and the labor movement not exactly useful. The mainstream labor movement not exactly that useful in what's left of it, that useful in defending and in any of that kind of real forward thinking about reorganizing and the ideological basis for reorganizing the working class.
Yeah, no question. So future guest, not sure about the date, Sean Richmond has written a really interesting book called Tell the Bosses That We're Coming, about just trying to at least get people to think about what what labor strategy could look like. That's not just like that's not just try harder to organize, want it more. Can
I just say it's one of the best things, my favorite things about Jane McAlevy's book or books now is that one of the core points about organizing for her is that it isn't someone coming in and organizing a bunch of workers, but coming in, you've only achieved organizing once they can organize themselves. And until that point, which is, it's self-determination. That's the aim. You're not trying to go and do something for people. That's the real moment of organization, when the organizer, the person set in the organized workplace, doesn't need to be there, when they already know and desire to run the show themselves.
Yeah. I mean, and in terms of a broader sense of running the show themselves, I mean, like there's a sense, I was thinking about listening to Rob before, this is something I've always thought, like, come on, there's got to be some way to connect the way that so many people, not just even people from super privileged backgrounds, but so many people for whom it's never going to happen, are like their highest aspiration is to own their own business, with the socialist impulse that we want everybody to cooperatively run their own businesses, because that sort of desire for autonomy, is at the core of why people want that so badly. Why, in fact, they prefer that maybe to a really highly paid job, where they were still, a wage laborer. But of course, to get there, you'd have to have that, build up that infrastructure, of a workers' movement that was organically linked to it, so that people could start to process those aspirations for greater autonomy that way. So we could obviously go on for hours, but you both of you guys have been incredibly generous with your time. Rob, Alex, it is always a pleasure. I love talking to both of you guys.
Great times, man. Always a lot of fun.
All right. Likewise. Thanks a lot for having me on, Ben.
I am now joined by the great David Griscom, who before we get to the business at hand, I should say this is really exciting stuff, is now the co-host with a friend of the show and multiple offender past guest Matt Leck of a new Twitch channel and eventually a new show called Left Reckoning.
Yeah, man, we're really excited. Thank you to everybody who's joined us over at Left Reckoning. It's going to be a really exciting project to be able to build off of the work that we've been able to do for the past few years with TMBS, but also sort of broaden that out a little bit and, expand the stories that we're covering, and also to basically, try to relocate some of this left-wing media away from for being too much of a Brooklyn scene. But for people who are interested, we do have our YouTube channel up. We haven't put any videos up on it yet, but I think on Monday at 7 Eastern, Matt and I are going to be doing a live stream, think tank style. So definitely check that out.
Yeah. So yeah, well, I'm excited by it.
Yeah. You'll definitely be. Yeah, we're looking forward to having Ben on sometime soon.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Absolutely. So yeah, I know you mentioned this. I think I managed through unfair mechanism because I had advance notice to get in the door as the first Left Reckoning. So
yeah, he beat my mother.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
Not everybody's mother would be, but I know yours would because she's a patron of this show. So.
That's true too. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, it's going to be really exciting. I mean, so in December, basically, we sort of launched this on a quicker timeline than we had initially intended. So, December, we're going to be doing a lot on our Twitch channel and YouTube, streams and things like that. We might have some guests. We haven't decided yet, but we're going to start doing shows every Thursday night at 7 Eastern, starting at either the last week of December or the first week of January.
Very nice. Well, I should. Okay. Well, first of all, first things first.
Cheers.
Cheers. So yeah, we're doing something a little bit different for Outlaws and Revolutionaries today, which is that whereas I'm sure that you'll you tell us a little bit about the artist, we're really gonna hone in on a specific album today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about Sturgill Simpson, and specifically his most recent album, I think, came out in October, called Cuttin Grass, which is a bluegrass album, and it's phenomenal. Some new stuff, but a lot of just reimagining songs that he had already put out in the past with this incredible crew of people, bluegrass players, people who are interested in bluegrass, like Tim O'Brien, Mark Howard, Scott Vestal, Stuart Duncan, Sierra Hull, all play on this album, and they're just ace pickers. So it's a phenomenal album out there, but I hope that people who are listening to this are familiar with Sturgill Simpson, and if not, just give them a little bit of a taste. This is a guy who, in my opinion, is probably one of the few like real outlaw country artists still making music, and I mean that in the full sense of being a little bit of a radical, but doing his own thing. He got really big with an album that came out in 2014 called Meta Modern Sounded Country Music. I don't know if you ever heard that before, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard of that. I actually haven't listened to that album, but I've seen I've seen the title.
Yeah, I mean, it's a phenomenal one by far.
Yeah, I guess. Actually, in this album, Cuttin Grass, there's a little bit. There's a line. There's a line in one of the songs about like how you're not going to see me at the Country Music Awards, but I'll always be in the smoky bar with the dim lighting and the bad sound system, which is which certainly tells you something about the ethos. Also, apparently a radical and a bit of a radical in another sense, which is that I didn't know that until somebody told me of this on Twitter, but apparently he's been a past guest on the Trillbilly Workers Party podcast.
Oh yeah, man, and that's a phenomenal episode. I highly suggest people listen to it. I was so jealous, man. I was spit mad. I'm happy for them. It's awesome. No, but he's like, he didn't just appear. I mean, there's been some interviews I've seen with him where he's wearing their T-shirts. So he's a big fan of it, which is great to have, somebody with connections to left-wing politics out there too. Again, man, he's the real deal through and through. So that album in 2014, I think is quite radical. I just have to say, because, it is so frustrating. Like country music for a really long time was, quite revolutionary just musically, in the sense that, well, it maintained certain kind of structures and sound, and something that you could definitely recognize, oh, that's a country song. It was always quick to incorporate new ways of playing, and for example, think about something like the steel guitar. I mean, when that first started got into country music, I mean, that was a pretty bizarre instrument, and there's nothing really about compressed electric sound like that is particularly country, but they made it country. And that's why Sturgill Simpson's like kind of psychedelic country, his 2014 album is, I think, so great. But this album is just a phenomenal like tour of his music and range, and also of bluegrass, which is a music that I really love. That's how I started playing. I play banjo and guitar, and for the most part, that's how I was learning to play those instruments. I was learning these old fiddle tunes and bluegrass tunes. So it's a song that I really like a lot. Breaker's Roar is a great song early on in the album. As much as this album does, it has like a real ethereal quality to it. And the mandolin player, Sierra Hull, is just phenomenal, has some incredible solos in that song. And it really reminds you how much you can do with just a few instruments in a room. I mean, I love, distortion and all the effects that you can put out there, but there's something really beautiful about this kind of, unplugged and acoustic, but it doesn't sound like most other genres when they do acoustic music, because it's not flat at all. It's exceptionally rich, and there's a lot going on in the background.
Yeah, I think for this album, like especially, and yeah, I mean, I don't know, bluegrass that well is a genre, although I do really like a lot of it, and kind of came on some of it by like a really weird route, because there's this band called Iron Horse that does bluegrass covers of rock music. And I was some of which I've got to say like work so weirdly well, like Metallica's Unforgiven, like the bluegrass version of that. Sounds so good and sounds so natural that like you would think this was just like some old bluegrass song that Metallica did a hard rock cover of. But this one in particular, like I think this album, I think the combination of the like instrumental simplicity, the simplicity of the sound, and the intensity of it, right? It's a very fast album and that bluegrass kind of way, and the fact that like the lyrics are so emotionally raw, and even I don't know exactly, like sort of sad, sort of dreamy.
A lot of them are really dreamy. I mean, like a few of the so a lot of these songs are songs that he's already put out on his previous albums, but they work really well as bluegrass songs, like Just Let Go. I mean, that's a song about, it's like, I woke up today, I decided I'm going to kill my ego, right? That's a song about going on a pretty nice psychedelic trip. But it works so well musically to sort of have that kind of homey, bluegrass roll going on in the background, while sort of thinking about, escaping from yourself in this kind of, psychedelic way, which I think was so fun about Sturgill Simpson in general, is like, anything regarding like psychedelics or even taking drugs, so much of that is like sort of dominated in people's imaginations by like, rock and roll, hip hop, or, then obviously like the most cliche, like Asian stereotypes kind of scene, right? What's so great about Sturgill Simpson is that I like, at least, is that he sort of is able to explore those parts of life that are just as much, true to somebody from Kentucky who loves bluegrass music as anybody else. Another great song, on the album is Turtles All the Way Down, which is
just going to bring that up. That's, I love that song. I love that song so much. It's like in a weird way, it's it's almost this, well, as you might guess from the title, right? Which comes from a like a classic thing attributed to Darwin's Charles Darwin's ally and public defender Huxley. Supposedly talked to somebody, some woman after a lecture who said she believed the earth was on top of a giant turtle. And he says, what's the turtle on top of? And she says, oh, another turtle. He says, well, what's that? And she says, oh, you can't fool me, Mr. Huxley. It's turtles all the way down.
Yeah.
And so as that sort of indicates, like in a weird way, it's like kind of like a it's sort of like, like there are elements of it. Obviously it's playing with themes about religion, and there are elements of it. It's almost like this kind of atheist anthem, but as that would sort of indicate, but it's like also like really sort of, it's not strident. It's like it's sad, it's heartfelt, and it also actually explicitly references in the lyric stuff about LSD and psilocybin and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I just remember one time Sturgill did a concert at the NPR's Tiny Desk. And before he played that song Turtles All the Way Down, he's like, basically saying like, all y'all crack me up because you write all these things about my songs. I don't even know what you're talking about. Most of these songs are just about doing drugs. Which is why I'm always hesitant right now to like give too many of my interpretations for some of the things. I don't want to get roasted one day. But all of those, like the kind of psychedelic songs are phenomenal. There's
I do just want to say, like, he starts he starts the song talking about Jesus and the Buddha, with this kind of poetic imagery about them, but then and then he goes into talking about psychedelics, in the explicitly and psychedelic imagery, right? Reptile aliens made of light, and then sort of transitions from that to talking about love, marijuana, LSD, psilocybin, and then DMT. They all change the way I see, but love's the only thing that ever saved my life.
Yeah, that's true.
Then the last stanza, has the thing that was kind of referenced. It says, "So don't waste your mind on nursery rhymes of fairy tales of blood and wine. It's turtles all the way down the line. So to each their own till we go home. To other realms our souls must roam. To and through the myth we call space and time." So it's like, it's sort of like it's sort of, kind of like walking the line between what you might expect if you know where that title comes from, and being this like sort of like sad, trippy song about love, love.
It's it's why he's just such an incredible and unique artist. And you have that, and another song which I just think is very appropriate for this segment, Sometimes Wine. I like a lot, where he goes, "I've always tried to keep my glass full. Sometimes I have whiskey and sometimes wine. Baby, why is it your glass is always empty? You come along and knock over for mine." And he basically talk about his partner leaving him, and he goes like, "I can't tell you how much I paid for this bottle and how long we've been here. Your guess is as good as mine. Sometimes that wine don't hit me like it ought to, but that old whiskey suits me fine." Yeah, exactly. Like he can do them all. Like he can go for being quite like radical and like and revolutionary, and I'm just saying this like musically and artistically and lyrically, to just writing like country bops, man. Just like old school like country songs. Like "Life Ain't Fair and the World Is Mean" is my favorite song, I think, on that album. And his original version of it on High Top Mountain, which is an album like that was his breakout album that he like self-financed. It's got like the original version has some real like Waylon Jennings vibes, so I really liked it a lot for that. But he has this great line in here. It goes, "Daddy was a highwayman, but he never wrote any old country songs. Papa never stayed out raising hell to the bleak of dawn, but he raised a proud coal miner's daughter, and I'm proud to be her son. She told me, boy, I don't care if you hit it big, because you're already number one. Still, you won't hear my songs on the radio or see me at the CMAs, but you can always find me in a smoky bar with bad sound and dim lit stage." And like that song, like the original version, I love, but it works so well as a bluegrass song too. And that's why I think this album was really fun. It's like, not doing anything because you're not like completely reimagining your music, but just saying like, oh, look, this is a different way to present these songs, and something that's, I'm sure for, he's from Kentucky, and he says it took him a long while to come around to bluegrass, since his grandfather was always like, trying to shove it down his throat. But spending a lot of time in Nashville, like hanging out with those, the old heads and the people who are still playing this kind of really traditional music is great, because you can sort of keep your head above the noise. And I did want to mention, because it is worth mentioning, so much about, this segment is about, pointing out some of the problems with modern country music. His response to the CMAs, which if people aren't familiar with, at the CMAs, they didn't do anything to honor John Prine, somebody who had actually taken Sturgill in a pretty big way in his career. They didn't do anything to honor John Prine, nor did they do anything to honor Billy Joe Shaver, by the way. But he has this great line that I just have to share with everybody that he posted on his Instagram after the they didn't do anything to honor John Prine. He says, "Don't get it twisted. I wouldn't be caught dead at this tacky ass glitter and Botox cake and cock pony show, even if my chair had a morphine drip. I just wanted to see if they would say his name, but nope, no time for Buddha. And I promise you they were asked to include him. So a nope, no time decision was made by somebody on Veterans Day, no less." I think it's 100% on point. And I think it's good that more and more people are realizing that the CMAs in that entire industry, the people who run it are jokers, and they have no respect for the music or the people who made it big. And I love having somebody like Sturgill Simpson still coming out with awesome new projects. And also just like trying to pull people away from this really, really nasty move that we've seen in country music towards like the CMAs and that kind of more corporate side of country music.
Yeah, absolutely. And the song you just quoted, about the his mother being a coal miner's daughter, reminds me of a song that's on this album that I think it would be remiss for us not to mention, since whereas to his credit, right, he's not just like doing that thing of like sort of terrible political music where you just sort of rhyme slogans and put it over some guitar picking, but the one where in a glancing way, in a poetic way, and tying in with a lot of the content of those other songs that are about loss and like God, I mean, I think the phrase like, the world is a dream, is like, it comes up like a bunch of times this album, the drug stuff and all this that ties all that in, but is also, the most political song in the album is Old King Cole. Yeah, for sure. And that's a phenomenal, song, as you were saying. Like, I love the lines in it too, because it's like, it's not just like actually like a conservative lament either for like the times lost. It's very much about like, this has been difficult for all of us. And now we're in a situation where this entire region area has been gutted out and we don't know if there's any kind of future. And like, one of the lines, and if people can't guess by the title, the song's about living in coal country and the struggles that come with it. But he says, "I'll be one of the first in a long line not to go down from that black old lung. My death will be slower than the rest of my kind, and my life will be sadder than the songs they all sung. Well, now, Old King Cole, what are we going to do when the mountains are gone and so are you?" And I think that is, just a phenomenal way to put it, because again, it's like not a kind of overarching celebration. Yeah, it's not romanticizing it. It's saying the black lung that everyone in my family's died of the black. Yeah, exactly. But it's also saying like we're not coming out of it any better. And like that's the point. Is like, okay, I might not have to be putting myself through that work anymore, but we're not really finding our way into a different situation or different like epoch. And it's phenomenal. I also I highly suggest again, the Trailbillies is a good show just in general, but their interview with him, they basically just talked to him about J.D. Vance. I don't know if you're familiar with him, Ben, the hillbilly elegy guy. Oh yeah. Which actually, so the Trailbilly guys just went on Chapo to do an episode about nice. The Netflix hillbilly elegy movie, which is a very funny episode in all the ways that you'd imagine. But yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance is really like the sort of a pretty close equivalent in some ways to like a certain sort of black conservative who makes a living telling white conservatives that like the reason that black people live in poverty is because of bad culture. And he does it at the expense like the personal expense of his family too, which I always just find really disgusting. Yeah. You know what I mean? Just like exposing problems in his family. Anyway, yeah, he sucks and his book sucks and don't read it. yeah, which is actually the first thing. If anybody goes back and watches, actually the first, I think this is true. The first political YouTube video, that I ever did, which was which is in 2018. I gave a presentation at this conference in Boise, Idaho, which is where, you can hear in the Q&A at the end of the presentation, you can hear a friend of the show, Derek Varn, and our late friend and brother Michael Brooks in the Q&A. And like a big part of what we were talking about is, the thing was about Jordan Peterson, and it was about this sort of like, longings for a more like stable and fulfilling life that, animate people, sort of confuse young seekers to follow this guy. And that's actually something, JD Vance wasn't name checked, but I mean, that's something we were talking about in that discussion at the end of the Q&A, the way that like, both some like, never Trump Republican, like National Review types, and also liberals, like the ones who love, hillbilly elegy, have sort of adopted this view that, because like there were a couple weeks after the election before everybody fixated on Russia, when the obsession was with the so-called WWC, the white working class, which is a phrase that I always hated because for one thing, it framed post-industrial dislocation as an exclusively white issue, which is actually the opposite of the true. It's a disproportionately non-white issue.
As Comrade Malika Jabali has been covering very well for years now.
Yeah, exactly, right. And the really and what these people being critiqued there like really get out of that is that, the problem if people in what was once coal country, for example, are living in bad conditions, because the mines are shut down. That's really on them for not becoming like postmodern nomads, crossing the country and throwing away all their family connections to try to find some work anywhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just has to be noted if we're talking about Vance, is that like, he's an AEI stooge. Like, this is not some guy who just like came out of nowhere and was like, oh, I'm going to write a book about my life. This is somebody who's been, spending years of his life, promoting, the most reactionary right wing free market politics, who's now cashing in.
Yeah, I mean, like this is somebody who's so much in that world that, as was pointed out in that episode.
And it's just like, that book is like, who the hell is it for? I mean, that book is, it's just, it's just something that gets under my skin. It's a zoo for liberals. It's literally for like New York City liberals to be like, I don't know what the rest of the country is like. I'll read a book, on these people so I can understand them. It's just like, it's a really weird kind of like circus view of how the rest of the country lives. And it's like, that's who the audience is. Like, the audience of that book is clearly not anybody from there, to try to find proper solutions.
And again, like, I mean, you were mentioning about Malika Jabali, right? Who do you think lives in Flint and Detroit and Wisconsin? But, Milwaukee, that a lot of Malika stuff was focusing on. But even in these other areas, like West Virginia, which, by the way, JD Vance has like the most tenuous, like his family is from the area he's writing about. But like,
he spent his summers down there basically, exactly. And then go back to Columbus or whatever.
Yeah. And he's so much part of that, like, right-wing ghoul think tank world that he basically, even though like he doesn't really talk about religious stuff that much or hardly any, right? He basically converted to Catholicism to get in with the First Things crowd. So like this, which is, I think, as was pointed out, maybe, if you want to talk about hillbillies, maybe the least, culturally authentic,
exactly.
you could possibly do there.
That's true. But that's why he got out, Ben. It's like he got this. Jesus Christ, yeah.
Well, exactly, right. That since he got out, because, and this relates to what I was talking about with Matt and Alex and Rob earlier, right? That it's this sort of view that like the main problem, like really in this worldview with, if his, family screwed up, his, mom is, is an addict or whatever, like the main problem with that is that if they have a precious boy like JD Vance, that means that he might not be able to advance to the meritocracy.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, I love, that song, I mean, King Cole, the way that it frames the sort of transition from, it's from making a living off that old black gold, and now there's ain't nothing but welfare and pills, and the wind never felt.
Yeah.
So It's both like, it's both really, really evocative about what that experience is like, and also it's, and it tells you something, like he talks, later on about people, people who are, came from the city to lend a hand, carrying signs saying, "Shut the mines down. We're looking for pity and you don't understand." And again, he's not, look, it's a song. It's not an op-ed, right? He's not like endorsing any particular solution here, but he is squeezing poetry out of the tensions in the situation, and which include the fact that he does have absolutely no illusions about it, right? I mean, that line we were talking about earlier about everybody dying of black lung, but he also recognizes that due to the kind of world we're living in, if you're going to, replace it with nothing, or you're going to replace it, with, I don't know,
for service, man. It's service. It's just like selling clothes and selling food, right? And it's just like that's not going to keep a community alive, and that's sort of been the American strategy.
Where people can, grant for a job center where people can learn how to code and compete with 22-year-olds who just graduated from college, which is like the idea. I mean, that's not even like the AAI freaks idea of a solution. Like that's the liberals' idea of a solution.
No, I remember Barack Obama coming out, with that plan very specifically. It must have been like, it was right before the election because I was working at Al-Arabiya and I had to just like take hours of notes on like Obama speeches and political speeches. And it was Obama, I can't remember what it was exactly, like a part of what, but it was like, jumpstart kind of program. Like, this is how we're going to bring jobs back to the, to coal country. And literally was just like, yeah, we'll help you learn to code.
And then good luck. Yeah, absolutely.
Honestly, internally, that's my time. Like that's where like the kind of nightmare of pre-Trump began for me. Now that I think about it, is Obama telling us the code. Sorry, what?
Which, and by the way, it's also a good, because I remember reading the other week that that by the end, directly related to this, because one of the things that Trump said, when he was campaigning was for West Virginia, is he was going to bring the coal mines back. And that industry actually is ending the Trump presidency, with something like 20% fewer jobs than even what fewer left.
Yeah.
At the beginning of it, but I mean, at least that's tapping into, to that desire, was a powerful thing, for Trump there, as it was, with the equivalents, many places elsewhere, since, exactly the contradiction that's being, sung about in Old King Coal, that, that this is, these were terrible jobs, but you could live off of it and feel like you were building something, and you had some kind of life. Whereas obviously, nothing that came afterwards, nothing that came afterwards gives that. So it's a, it's a really, it's a powerful song. Everything on that album, is really powerful, and it's like it's a very, I guess I'll just close with this, like it's kind of hard to describe, but like it's a very particular combination of being this sort of, in terms of content, this kind of slow, sad, poetic reflection, and in terms of presentation, like being really propulsive and and going very quickly, and it's really compelling. People should listen to it.
I think so.
All right, thanks, brother. You know what you want to do next week?
I don't know. I might need to think about it a little bit.
Yeah. I wouldn't be against sticking with Sturgill for another week.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Why not?
All right, sounds good, man.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later. All right. That was the great David Griscom, formerly of the Michael Brooks Show, now co-host with Matt Leck of Left Reckoning. We were talking about Sturgill Simpson, as I think we just decided we were going to continue to do next week. And before that, I was chatting with three of my favorite academics. And of course, one of the reasons that they're three of my favorite academics is they're not just academics, that they use what they know in their fields, economics and history, respectively, to try to advance radical politics in the real world and write for a popular audience. So those would be Matt Karp as a contributing editor to Jacobin, Alex Gourevitch, also a historian, somebody who's written really interesting things about labor republicanism, and a Jacobin contributor, and Rob Larson, who's the House Economist at Current Affairs magazine. So always really, really happy to talk to those guys. If you like what we're doing here, please do consider becoming a patron. So $5 a month, you get early access to every single episode. You can, sit in online on them being recorded. You also get regular Discord office hours, group voice chats. We did one last week. It was a lot of fun. And of course, access to the Discord, also trying to prepare a bunch of other bonus content for patrons, all of which is a gesture of appreciation, because it means a lot to me that that the show has been able to grow as quickly as it can, and I hope that it can grow even more, so that like I always say, all the people who behind the scenes who help make this happen can make a living wage, from doing it, or at least a part-time piece of a living wage from the work they do on the show. Ultimately, I'd love to be able to make a living wage just doing this, teach less and do more of that, promoting radical politics in the real world. But in any case, the guest next week should be a really good episode. Are going to be Natalie Wynn, better known by the name of her YouTube channel, ContraPoints, and Amber Lee Frost, who's, of course, a co-host of one of my favorite podcasts, Chapo Trap House. And we're going to be talking about a Catalyst article that she wrote about hashtag activism. The week after that, the great Anna Kasparian is returning to the podcast, and she is, I think, probably in the first part of the episode, is going to be another debate with a libertarian. In this case, I think Jason Lee Bias. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but from the Center for a Stateless Society. I think it's probably going to be Jason. He's probably going to come on the first part of the program, and then I'm going to talk to Anna. And then the week after that, I am going to be interviewing the one, the only Slavoj Žižek. So really looking forward to that episode. Really looking forward to the two before that I just mentioned. Really appreciate everybody who has been able to become a patron on the Patreon. And even the people who aren't in a position to do that, don't have the $5 a month, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts, like and subscribe on YouTube. These things really do make a big difference, and I really appreciate everybody who does them. That's it for the show, at least, not live streams. We're going to be doing live streams probably on, actually for sure going to be doing a starting, yesterday when you watch this, going to be doing a series of Sunday live streams on the YouTube channel, in which I and various guests watch and break down vintage debates. So the first one with Matt McManus was about the classic debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin at Oxford, in the civil rights era, which is a really interesting debate. In the future, I know Doug Lane is going to come on to talk about Destiny's debate with Michael Albert, who's one of the main advocates of a model of socialism called participatory economics, or Paracon. Also, I've been trying to do at least 3 or 4 YouTube live streams during the week, always at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So check that out. Again, please like and subscribe on YouTube. Please rate and review wherever you get podcasts. Come to Patreon if you can. Really appreciate all those forms of support. All of them mean a lot to me. Until next week, left is best.